In 1922, Yuli Martov lay dying in the small German village of Schönberg, exiled from his comrades in Soviet Russia. The Menshevik leader had come to Germany 2 years earlier for a speaking engagement, only to stay after his party was banned and he began to show signs of tuberculosis. The schism between the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks had begun in 1903, but the final break had come around 1912. With Martov turning against the Bolsheviks for good due to the actions of a certain Bolshevik troublemaker named Joseph Stalin. To Martov, the Bolsheviks were undermining the democracy they had once claimed to desire, and Stalin was one of its greatest liabilities. Following the Russian revolutions, Martov had revealed Stalin's involvement in a notorious robbery, which had briefly gotten him expelled from the party. In response, Stalin sued Martov for libel and even tried to have him prosecuted for treason. But Soviet Premier Vladimir Lenin and many other high-ranking Bolsheviks still held a certain fondness for Martov. They had come up together at the turn of the century, and Martov had sided with the Red Army in the Russian Civil War when most of the Mensheviks fled. So when Lenin learned that his old friend was dying in a foreign land, he asked the General Secretary of the Communist Party to transfer some funds for Martov's medical care. Unfortunately, the General Secretary refused. Martov succumbed to his illness in April 1923, forsaken and uncompensated. In 1920, the Jews of the former Russian Empire found themselves in a strange new world. After a century of traditional life in one of the most anti-Semitic regimes on earth, they suddenly found themselves enjoying equal citizenship, freedom of movement, and an end to the terroristic massacres that had dominated Jewish life during the late Empire and subsequent Civil War. There were now Jews in visible positions of power. For a brief period, Russia even had a Jewish president. At the same time, what it meant to be Jewish faced severe restrictions of its own. The ascendant communist regime was broadly opposed to organized religion and had little patience for dissent. But perhaps most significantly, the Civil War wasn't actually over. Though the reactionary white forces had been thoroughly defeated, the Red Army faced insurgencies and conflict with many of its former leftist allies, as well as continued foreign aggression to the east and west. In February 1919, a newly independent Poland launched a series of offensives pushing eastward in a bid to regain the lost territories of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. By the spring of 1920, they'd advanced as far as Kiev, and it looked like their dreams of restored glory would succeed. At this point, Polish forces occupied most of the Pale of Settlement to which most Jews under Russian rule had once been confined, transforming them into de facto citizens of the new Polish Republic. The response to this was mixed, both by the Jewish population and the Polish authorities. Jewish religious and political movements that had been shuttered by the Soviets were once again tolerated, and multi-party democracy briefly flourished among the Jewish communities of Belarus and Western Ukraine. But Poland's lack of a permanent constitution left those same Jewish leaders wary of their future status. At the same time, the presence of several Jewish figures in the Soviet leadership and continued opposition from pro-Bolshevik elements within the community encouraged some Polish soldiers to view all Jews as enemy insurgents. The result was a wave of pogroms that followed every Polish advance and retreat until a ceasefire was signed in October 1920. Just as the war with Poland was ending, the Soviet government in Moscow faced a new threat. When the Civil War had begun in 1918, the Bolsheviks had enjoyed modest outside support from a motley collection of agrarian socialists and anarchists, mostly operating as insurgents in southern Russia and Ukraine under the leadership of a small-time politician named Nestor Makhno. In the years to come, White Army veterans in the West, seeking to distance themselves from their own side's atrocities, would attempt to frame Makhno as a fanatical, murderous anti-Semite. But there's no evidence to support this, and quite a lot of evidence against it. While it's true that anarchist soldiers committed pogroms during the Civil War, this is true of every faction in the war. And while some of those factions had been unable or uninterested in confronting these atrocities, Makhno was exceptionally quick to respond to anti-Semitic violence in his own ranks. Most of the documentation supporting this comes courtesy of the many Jewish anarchists who worked and served alongside him. I've mentioned some Jewish anarchists on this channel before, but the anarchist movement of the early 20th century had many prominent Jewish leaders, and in late 1919, Makhno handed executive leadership of the insurgency to a Jewish colleague known simply as Volin. Despite the image you might have in your head of an anarchist, Volin came from an exceptionally privileged background by Russian Jewish standards. Born to assimilated Russian-speaking intellectuals outside the Pale of Settlement, Vsevolod Eichenbaum appeared destined for a life in academia before parlaying his skills as a spokesman for anarchism, participating in the January Revolution of 1905 and spending most of the First World War as a public speaker in the US. When the Russian monarchy was finally overthrown in 1917, Volin returned to his native land, and when civil war broke out the following year, he quickly sided with the Bolsheviks. But like Makhno, he remained outspoken in his opposition to Lenin's authoritarianism. Volin, Makhno, and their fellow anarchists could get away with this kind of talk because their assistance was essential to defeating the White armies. Bolshevik leaders had even offered Volin a cabinet position in Ukraine. But by early 1920, as the war shifted decisively against the Whites, that alliance began to break down. In January of that year, Volin was arrested and nearly executed on the orders of Defense Minister Leon Trotsky, a frequent target of Volin's criticisms. He regained his freedom in October, when the communists and anarchists formalized their alliance as part of a final push to defeat the Whites. But as soon as the Whites were defeated, the Bolsheviks permanently turned against the anarchists and other left-wing dissidents in what became known as the Green Phase of the Civil War. In 1921, Makhno fled to Romania while Volin was recaptured and permanently exiled. The Civil War finally came to an end in October 1922, with the withdrawal of Japanese forces from Vladivostok. During the Civil War, the Red Army had established Soviet client republics along the contested frontiers, both to co-opt competing nationalist movements and to demonstrate a clean break from the imperial policies of Russification. With the war over, Lenin and the cabinet began reorganizing Russia and its clients into a multicultural, multilingual federation. On the 29th of December, leaders of the 4 surviving Soviet republics signed a treaty establishing the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, with immediate elections for the new All-Union Congress of Soviets. Building on Lenin's rebuke of Russification, the government initiated a policy of indigenization, encouraging the official use of minority languages and subsidizing minority art and culture, so long as that art and culture conformed to communist doctrines. Dispersed across a vast area in which they were always a minority, Soviet Jewry presented an unusual challenge to implementing this policy, and the immediate results were mixed. Lenin himself had been outspoken in his opposition to anti-Semitism. During the Civil War, he'd given a speech condemning anti-Semitism and had encouraged the prosecution of Red Army soldiers who committed pogroms. But overall, he believed that anti-Semitism was a product of the old imperial order and preferred a hands-off approach to the Jewish question. Instead, the effort to Sovietize Jewish society fell to 2 organizations. The Jewish sections of the Communist Party, or Yevsektia, were responsible for making decisions about Jewish policy which would then be carried out by a government agency known as the Jewish Commissariat, or Evcom. Both of these bodies were led by Semyon Dimanstein, a lifelong Bolshevik who had used his authority during the Civil War to purge virtually all other Jewish political movements and communal organizations. Ironically, one of the few Jewish organizations not to be purged by the Yevsektia was the nominally Zionist political party Poale Zion, which even won a couple seats in the 1922 elections. During the Civil War, most of its members in Russia had sided with the Bolsheviks, while most of its members in Palestine had defected to form Achdut HaAvodah, leaving behind a Leninist faction that became the Palestine Communist Party. In short, Poale Zion was no longer a Zionist movement. Nevertheless, Dimanstein continued to engage in a personal vendetta against the party, leading to its eventual dissolution in 1928. But by far the most influential work of the Yevsektia and Evcom concerned the adoption of Yiddish as an official language. From a certain point of view, this was an obvious decision. The vast majority of Soviet Jews spoke Yiddish as their first language, and it's a language that was alien to most Jewish communists, who tended to come from privileged Russian-speaking families. To Lenin, the embrace of Yiddish was a rebuke of Russification, but to Dimanstein, it was the only way to reach the Jewish masses. Key to this project was the influx of Jewish activists to the Yevsektia from the former ranks of the General Jewish Labor Bund, a movement that had combined socialist politics with ideas of Jewish tribal autonomy and the promotion of Yiddish as a language of education and government. During the Civil War, most Bundists had sided with either the Mensheviks or the Ukrainian nationalists, which ensured their eventual dissolution by the Yevsektia. But in spite of that, many of its members flocked to the Yevsektia, viewing it as a continuation of Bundist ideals under the communist umbrella. By 1924, the Soviet Union had no fewer than 3 party-approved Yiddish-language newspapers, while Belarus, where Jews made up a plurality of the urban population, adopted Yiddish as one of 4 official languages, complete with Yiddish-language schools and courts. Nevertheless, adapting Yiddish as a language of administration was an uphill battle. Despite being spoken by millions, Yiddish scholarship was only in its infancy. For the previous 2 centuries, most Jewish academics tended to view it as a crude, unsophisticated jargon, a language of the ghetto to be discarded as Jewish populations obtained legal equality in their home countries. This attitude was especially common in Central and Western Europe, where the language had virtually gone extinct in a single generation around the turn of the 19th century. Only in the latter half of that century had this attitude begun to shift. Accordingly, the language lacked the necessary vocabulary for discussing subjects like math, science, sports, and law. In the new Yiddish language courts, lawyers and clerks often found it necessary to borrow terms from Russian. The first Yiddish language schools had no textbooks. Needless to say, the language would need a serious overhaul, and the process would take years. By contrast, Yiddish mass media and entertainment was able to hit the ground running. Back in the 1870s, the government of Romania had passed a series of laws severely restricting how many Jews could be employed in various sectors of the economy. One of the few sectors where Jews didn't face discrimination was the performing arts, so Yiddish literature, theater, and music took on a new significance as a symbol of Jewish resilience in the face of political discrimination. By the 1920s, Yiddish theater had spread all over Europe and the Americas, untainted by any historical association with religion or Zionism. So when playwright Alexei Granovsky founded the Soviet-sponsored Yiddish theater company Goset, the groundwork had already been laid. For political reasons, Goset was headquartered in Moscow, where Yiddish wasn't commonly spoken even among Jews. Granovsky himself didn't speak the language, but he brought a modern, cutting-edge sensibility that Yiddish theater lacked, as well as the unprecedented financial security afforded by state sponsorship. Touring major Yiddish centers more or less continuously, Goset staged revivals of established plays and literary adaptations alongside new original work inspired by the increasingly popular avant-garde movement, earning a reputation for exceptional production values and turning actor Solomon Michoels into a star. So too did Evcom sponsor a revival of Jewish-focused visual arts. After returning from his education in France, Marc Chagall had become one of the Soviet regime's most famous artists, founding a college for the arts in his predominantly Jewish hometown, Vitebsk. But Chagall had never been terribly fond of the Bolsheviks. He declined offers to serve in government and had clashed with Granovsky during a brief collaboration. By the formation of the Soviet Union in 1922, poor living standards had convinced him and his family to return to Paris. By far the most lasting impact of Jewish participation in the Soviet art world, at least to Westerners, was in cinema. Admittedly, there was no specific Yiddish film industry. This being the silent era, any movie could be translated just by switching out its intertitles. But the foundations laid by initiatives like Goset made it very easy for Jewish artists to pivot to the new medium. At the same time, Polish-born brothers Denis and Mikhail Kaufman came to Moscow during the Civil War to create highly experimental propaganda films, documentaries, and newsreels. If you have a mental image of experimental 1920s Soviet cinema, it's probably based on the work of the Kaufmans, though you might not recognize that name, as director Denis had long since adopted the pseudonym Dziga Vertov, Ukrainian for spinning top. By far their most famous work was 1929's Man with a Movie Camera, a wordless, kaleidoscopic documentary about filmmaking itself, directed by Denis and starring Mikhail. But much as we might like to talk about art, the core concept of Soviet rule, the thing which most distinguished it from any previous government, was its economic philosophy, Marxism. And the Jewish population quickly found itself at the forefront of one of the strangest moments in the history of the Soviet Union. In his magnum opus Das Kapital, Karl Marx described capitalism as a necessary stage in a country's economic development, without which there wouldn't be a large proletariat to seize the means of production. When he wrote this, he was mostly thinking about the countries where he'd lived, Germany, France, and Britain. He definitely wasn't thinking of Russia. At the turn of the century, the majority of Russian subjects still lived as subsistence farmers. What little heavy industry existed was usually state-sponsored, or controlled by politically connected oligarchs or meager foreign capital. Whether or not this made Russia sufficiently suited for socialist revolution became a dividing line between Lenin's Bolsheviks and Yuliy Martov's Mensheviks. And that was the situation before 1917. The First World War and Civil War had undone most of the industrialization that had taken place under the empire, with factories destroyed and major cities half abandoned as millions of people fled to the countryside. While statistics from this period are non-existent, GDP had likely fallen by more than 2/3. Industrial output had fallen by at least 80%. The system of grain requisitioning proved infeasible, sending Russia into a state of famine and provoking major uprisings which forced Lenin to make a series of economic concessions that came to be known as the New Economic Policy. In November 1920, the Executive Committee authorized foreign business concessions in Russia, opening up much-needed foreign investment. Taxes on food were slashed, and a central bank was established to regain control of the money supply. While not outright restoring private property, the government authorized the limited privatization of small businesses, whose managers could be subjected to a progressive income tax. The collectivization of agriculture was suspended. With a new constitution came a new version of the ruble, restoring the currency-based economy after years of wartime hyperinflation. This isn't an exhaustive catalog of policies, but it indicates just how desperate the situation had become, and how much Lenin and his allies were willing to compromise their original position in pursuit of their long-term vision. But for all that compromise, the new economic policy wasn't a return to the pre-revolutionary order. With very few exceptions, the privatization of small businesses consisted of requisitioning firms from their previous owners and leasing them out to new ones. Those who had owned businesses prior to the revolution were almost uniformly classified as lishentsy, barred from voting, joining trade unions, attending universities, or obtaining health insurance. Who qualified as a business owner was also extremely broad and generally included those who were self-employed full-time. Since Jews were disproportionately likely to be self-employed and live in cities, they experienced some of the highest levels of unemployment in the early 1920s. Lishentsy could petition the Soviets to restore their rights, but that usually required some proof of loyalty to the Communist Party at a time when party membership was the exception rather than the rule. Effectively locked out of Soviet society for life, most younger Lishentsy took the first opportunity available to flee the country. For example, film student Alyssa Rosenbaum, who was purged from her university but obtained a visa to resume her studies in the US, later working in Hollywood under the pseudonym Ayn Rand. For a brief period after the First World War, the mass exodus of Jews from Eastern Europe resumed as if the emperor was still in power. Ironically, the same conditions that caused Soviet Jews to disproportionately suffer under the new economic policy also disproportionately benefited them. Because they tended to live in cities and work as skilled craftsmen, Soviet Jews were uniquely qualified to fill the shoes of their former bosses and join the new party-approved bourgeoisie known pejoratively as netmen. To be clear, these businessmen were still classified as lishentsy and had to give up the same political and social rights as their predecessors in order to participate in the program. But since their existence came from the government's own policy, they were much more likely to have their civil rights restored later. It might seem strange to pass up the opportunity to vote or have health insurance in order to own a business, but for those who chose to do so, it was worth it. The new economic policy was an extraordinary success. In a single decade, the Soviet Union underwent a wave of industrialization, urbanization, and wealth creation that the Russian Empire had been unable to achieve in a century. By 1924, GDP had nearly rebounded to pre-war levels, and for the first time ever, what was now the Soviet Union had a large, robust, and influential middle class. But this newfound success also revived the specter of bourgeois institutions consolidating power away from the workers. leading to a renewed focus on the status of religious institutions. Because this is a channel about Jewish history, I'm going to focus on how Judaism was impacted by this, but know that most of what I'm about to say applied to all religions in the USSR. When the Bolsheviks first took power in 1917, they established a new constitution that guaranteed the free exercise of religion and a strict separation between church and state. This may be surprising to those familiar with communism's broad hostility toward religion. But as with federalization and nativization, Lenin sought to win over hearts and minds with a demonstrative break from the oppressive policies of the empire. Believing that religion would cease to be relevant with the achievement of socialism, he instead favored a policy regulating and disincentivizing religious practice by removing it from public life. Make no mistake, all places of worship had been seized as state property. Religious schools were banned, and the teaching of Hebrew was banned outside of universities. Hasidic Judaism, which had once reigned supreme in Ukraine, was almost entirely driven underground or out of the country, and the majority of synagogues were either demolished or repurposed as schools, theaters, and government offices. But almost without exception, these synagogues were targeted due to their size, visual prominence, or proximity to government or trade unionist institutions. It's worth remembering that the people responsible for formulating and carrying out these policies were almost entirely unassimilated Yiddish-speaking Jews in Evcom and the Yevsektia, who viewed themselves not as enemies of Jewish culture, but as its own internal revolutionaries. The Yevsektia were never fully embraced by the Jewish working class, who tended to regard them as a bunch of Leninist sellouts, but their campaign against religious Judaism received far less backlash than you might expect. Secularism had already been on the rise in the Jewish world for a century. This only slightly accelerated it, and continued religious practice was largely unimpeded. Kosher slaughter was still officially tolerated, and while rabbis were denied certain political rights as lichenzi, they continued to earn a living through religious governing boards similar to the consistories in 19th century France. All of these factors resulted in a new culture of religious laxity. By 1927, the majority of registered synagogue members were middle-aged or elderly lichenzi, barred from accessing most other social institutions. At the same time, most Jews under 40 continued to attend services during major holidays or weddings. By far the most resilient Jewish tradition in the USSR was circumcision, which for many fell into a gray area between religious ritual and ethnic signifier. Even the vast majority of Jewish Communist Party members continued to have their sons circumcised. If what I'm describing sounds very different from your idea of what life was like in the USSR, there's a reason. For all his historical importance as the founder of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Lenin's rule was incredibly short-lived. He'd been in ill health ever since Fanny Kaplan's assassination attempt in 1918. By the time of the Union Treaty, he'd suffered a serious stroke and suffered an even more serious one shortly after. The attention of the cabinet quickly turned to succession. On paper, the political structure of the Soviet Union wasn't so unusual. At its core was the Congress of Soviets, which elected the highest state bodies. What we would call the president was then known as the chairman of the Central Executive Committee, and like most heads of state, he was just a ceremonial figurehead. Executive power was vested in the Council of People's Commissars, or Sovnarkom, whose chairman, the premier, or prime minister, acted as head of government. As you might expect, Lenin was the premier. In September 1922, Lenin had tapped Trotsky to become deputy premier, but Trotsky turned the position down for reasons that will soon become clear, leaving the position to be filled by the more moderate Lev Kamenev and Alexei Rykov. But they were all of them deceived, for another leadership position was made. By reducing the Soviet Union to a one-party state, Lenin had created the conditions for political decision-making to bypass the constitutional process entirely. Accordingly, true power rested in whoever had the most clout. Up to his first stroke in May 1922, this was undoubtedly Lenin, but his future role was now uncertain. Joseph Stalin, having been appointed only a few weeks earlier to the unassuming position of General Secretary of the Communist Party, now had such potential. It was during this period that Stalin had prevented Lenin from assisting the dying Martov. In early 1923, a series of letters apparently dictated by Lenin appeared, indicating that he had perhaps realized what Martov had so many years earlier. that Stalin was a wolf in sheep's clothing, a monomaniacal provocateur motivated by little more than power and spite, a Russified chauvinist and racist, an emperor in waiting. Although these letters suggested removing Stalin as general secretary, nothing came of it. Instead, Stalin formed an alliance with Petrograd party boss Grigory Zinoviev and deputy premier Lev Kamenev with the goal of preventing Trotsky from taking power after Lenin's death. The success of the new economic plan resulted in a drop in food prices due to lower taxes and mechanization, while prices for manufactured goods rose due to increased demand. This was happening so quickly that Trotsky became convinced that its implementation would result in capitalist backsliding, breaking from the Leninist mainstream to form the left opposition. At the same time, the policy's foremost defenders rallied around Deputy Premier Rykov and Pravda editor Nikolai Bukharin, forming the right opposition. While all of these men continued to hold real power, the divisions between them only served to strengthen the troika of Stalin, Kamenev, and Zinoviev. On the 21st of January 1924, after just 1 year and 1 month as leader of the Soviet Union, Lenin died and Rykov became premier. But true power remained in the hands of the troika. By 1925, Stalin alone reigned supreme. In due time, almost every aspect of life, work, and politics in the Soviet Union would change just as dramatically as they had under Lenin, and the consequences for minority groups, including Jews, would be exceptionally dire. But that's a story for another time. Special thanks to my patrons, including Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, FC, Matthew Feinberg, Jay Fleischman, Oshar Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Sol Cohn, Jacob Kossoff, and Jeffrey Schweitzer.